And at 10:06 here on KMHL in Marshall, again 59 degrees, our current reading on our thermometer here as we continue on June the 13th, and a day that, if you've been around the area for many years, really kind of a day that you don't forget, as June 13th, 1968, the date of the Tracy tornado, the first F5 tornado ever recorded in Minnesota, and we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning here on KMHL with Scott Thoma, an author, Tracy native, and now residing in Wilmer, who's written a new book, Out of the Blue. It's the true story of two sisters and their miraculous survival in one of the most powerful tornadoes in Minnesota history. And Scott is on the line with us this morning. And Scott, a very good morning to you, and thanks for your time today.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on. Now, tell us a little bit about your experience in Tracy and what that day was like for you to start things off.
I was 9 years old that day, and I was outside playing in the backyard, and the storm's coming up, and no one knew it was going to be quite as bad as it was. And it rained real hard, and then it hailed, about the size of golf balls, which is very common before a tornado. And my sister and I are picking up hailstones in our little plastic sand pails, and I know after talking to many people, a lot of people were doing that. And all of a sudden you look up and the sky was this weird pea green color that I have never seen since that. I've never seen a sky like that. And you hear the siren, and you go from there. My dad rushed us down into the basement with my sister and I and my mother, and he laid on top of us, so I knew he thought it was something pretty bad. And you could hear, you hear talk all the time of people saying when they're in a tornado, it sounds like a train. And in the old days, you used to play under the train trestles and everything, and it did. It sounded exactly like a train just going right overhead of you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as far as your home was concerned and your family, was there damage to your home?
We were about a half a block east of the elementary school, which was damaged beyond repair. Our house, we were like on the edge. It got turned on the foundation. It didn't get wrecked, or we couldn't stay in it for a while, but we did have to move because it got turned, but it didn't get damaged like most of the homes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when you write this book, I'm sure that it just brings all those memories flooding back. What was the inspiration for you? What kind of got you going on this project?
Well, my mother had started, she always wanted to write something on it because our neighbor was a surgical nurse, and when she came out of the basement, she was there when a couple of the people that were killed were pulled out of the basement, and she, to make sure that they were dead or alive, and then she rushed to the hospital. So she had some pretty good stories to tell, and I know her and my mother sat down, and I found all these notes when my parents passed away, when I was cleaning out the house, and I just got inspired to do it again. Plus, one of the sisters was a grade behind me in school, so I knew her pretty well. And I heard so many different variations of the story, and I just was curious to see which one was right. And then as I started getting into it more and more, it was exciting to talk about and bring back all those memories. Not that they were pleasant memories, but it still made a big impact on everybody's life.
Yeah, for sure. And so you go on from that and bring this book to the public then, and putting it together. Out of the Blue is the name of the book, and you can get it at tomabooks.com and find out more about the book a little bit. Tell us about compiling this story then, and what made you go in the direction of these two sisters.
Well, like I said, the one sister was a grade below me, so I knew her from school, and I just thought that was so compelling that two people were actually taken out of their home and blown, right by this tornado. And when I was working on the book, I got a hold of a lot of tornado experts and storm chasers and things like that, and meteorologists, and every one of them agreed when I told them the story that they can't believe they weren't killed, because there's so many things outside, this is what they were telling me, that pebbles can become bullets, and they said one of the worst things is shingles from a house will start spinning like circular saw blades out there, and to be blown among all that, plus bricks and big branches and everything, and not get hit. Well, I mean, one of them was injured worse than the other, but it was just kind of a miracle that they weren't killed out there.
Yeah, for sure. And, the two gals, Linda Vasky now, but Linda Hogan and Pam Hogan were the two sisters that you write about. What were the variations between the stories of the two gals?
The older sister, she's now Linda Torts, and she's been remarried. It was Linda Vasky at the time. She was 20, and Pam was 8 at the time. And there was a 2-year-old that Linda and her husband, they were in their 20s, or at 20. He was off to serve in Vietnam. So she was by herself, and they were adopting this 2-year-old. And she had the 2-year-old at her home, and they were in the process of the adoption and everything. They had to wait till he came back from the service, and she's taking care of her little sister was over visiting, this Pam, who was 8, and she's trying to take care of both of these two, and the tornado did take the 3 of them outside, and the little girl was killed, and she held this guilt for being responsible for this little girl for years and years and years. And I think interviewing her, she was a little apprehensive to talk about it at first, and as we got going on it, she opened up, and you could see that she just felt better just to get it off her chest and know that it wasn't her fault and there wasn't much she could do about it. But Pam was 8 and doesn't recall quite as much as the older sister, but just her experience of she was blown out of the house over a block away, sat down on her feet, which is amazing. She never spun around in the air. She was carried vertically the whole time, sat down, about 2 seconds, picked back up, and blown back to where she started from, right by the steps, and then the house was gone in the meantime. And that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, my goodness, that's quite the story for those two gals. And for Linda to talk about that, is that the first time in visiting with you for this book project, is that the first time she'd really kind of talked about it in full force?
She was granted interviews, and, like on the anniversaries of the tornadoes, and I've read all of them, and the story kind of varied. And it didn't go into a lot of detail. You could tell she was holding back something, and I didn't know what, but I just was curious to know, well, how did the little girl die, and how did, it feel to be blown out? There was no detail on what she saw when she was outside or experienced or anything. And she, like I said, she didn't want to do the book at first, and she wasn't rude about it or anything. She was very nice about it, but, I told her to think about it, and I called her, and we kept talking, and then finally she did, but she was holding back for quite some time, and then all of a sudden she finally, admitted that she felt guilty for, this little girl and everything. It was almost therapeutic for her to release this. She didn't talk about it with her husband that much. Her kids couldn't wait to see the book because they really didn't know much about it, because Mom didn't talk to them about it, they said. It was just kind of, after all these years, they're even learning about what happened to their own mother, so.
Yeah, well, I'm sure a real therapeutic experience for her, too, to, like you say, get that, almost a weight lifted off of your shoulders to...
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so you talk with those two gals and do have quite a focus in this book about that, but, boy, you sure get a good look at many of the other players that played a big role in, the events that unfolded in this day in 1968.
Right. There were no storm chasers back then, which are such an important part now. They have this sophisticated equipment and spotters and trackers. There were spotters back then, but they weren't as educated and have the equipment as they do now. And it was a farm family, Delpha and Melvin Cook, that spotted the tornado out a few miles southwest of Tracy, and she was a nurse at the Tracy hospital, so she knew that, they watched the tornado heading into Tracy, and they phoned it in, and if not for them phoning that in that quickly, I think there would have been more deaths. And she and her husband, Delpha and Melvin, were given a big award from the state climatology office and everything for their saving many more lives.
Yeah, for sure. And, those both Delpha and Melvin have passed away here recently, and Alan and Bruce, their two children that were, with them too. It's quite interesting to get all the different perspectives that that day holds for so many different people, isn't it?
Absolutely. They still all have memories of that day, and it's 44 years, and it's the people that experience that, it's like yesterday.
Yeah, for sure. There's no doubt about that. And this book is a great, I guess, a great way to kind of remember that day in 1968 on June the 13th. And as far as the people that lost their lives on that day, how does the book remember them and pay homage to them, I guess?
The thing with the 9 that were killed in the tornado, none of them were in the basement. So everyone that did make it to the basement lived, that's rare now, especially with, like I said, no storm chasers to give them advanced warning or anything. There were 2 of them that went down in the basement, and one came up early thinking it had already passed. The other one, there's variations of that story too, but she went up to get her purse, and they found her killed halfway up the basement steps. The other one tried to outrun it in the car and things like that. And everyone wants to be remembered, and I don't want anyone to ever forget these 9 people. And I tried to put a chapter in there about each one person, a little bit about them, not a lot, but a little bit about their background, and then how each one of them were killed.
Yeah, it's a very sad story for those that did lose their life, and for those that remember that day and were fortunate enough to survive it. I would imagine that many of those people, much like Linda, have those memories still harbored and maybe haven't gotten that therapeutic release that she has in this process.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the people that were killed, there was, in some cases there were other family members with them, and to emerge from the basement and see them, family, a loved one, a relative, or a neighbor, it's an experience that you try to block out of your mind. I think a lot of people I interviewed were the same way as, like you said, with Linda. They didn't really want to talk about it at first, and then when you get into it a little more, they release and tell you a little more detail, and it's interesting. It's very, very sad, but it's really interesting how these things happen.
Yeah, for sure. And, to hear the experiences, I just find it fascinating. I was doing some research before talking to you this morning, and ran across a blog by Audrey Kletcher Helbling, and she's read your book, and, to hear her recounting of that from, up in the Wabasso-Vesta area, and the different stories that you hear from people that were at Revere or Lamberton, and thought that it was a lot closer than that tornado really was because of its sheer size.
Right, and the thing when you're doing interviews on the book, and more people hear about it and give you stories and stuff, all the small towns around Tracy, those people all came to Tracy to witness that. It's like people like to gawk at a car accident, and who wouldn't want to come and see what something like that, and especially it was the first F5 tornado in Minnesota history. But so many people, they say cars were lined up 2 miles on either side of Highway 14 with people wanting to come into town. And I think the tornado hit on a Thursday, and I believe it was the next Tuesday when they took the roadblocks down so everybody could come in, and it was like, it was like nothing you could ever see. I did see an aerial shot of the cars lined up, and it was just unreal.
Yeah, for sure. And, probably the most lasting photograph of that tornado, and probably one of the more popular photos of a tornado in the United States is that picture that was snapped by Eric Lance. Tell us a little bit about that one and how that became a part of the book and the lore of this day.
Eric's father and uncle were owners of the Walnut Grove Tribune, and Eric was 16 at the time, and he helped them. He did stories, he took pictures. His uncle Everett came to their house that night and said that he had seen there was a tornado. It looked like it was toward Tracy, so Eric and his dad jumped in the car and they headed west to Tracy, and they cut it off as it was leaving Tracy. Excuse me. And Eric jumped out of the car and took some photos, and he had a nice camera, but it wasn't anything like the cameras are now, and he captured just some phenomenal photos of it, and he got third place in the national photo contest, which means he beat out war correspondents and a lot of other, veteran photographers. He just happened to be at the right place at the right time, is how he described it. And I got a hold of him. It took me some time to track him down, and he works for the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, and he's semi-retired now. He was a radiologist, and when I did a book signing in Tracy over Memorial Weekend, I hadn't met him in person ever, and he surprised me and drove all the way down to meet me, and it was really touching that he did that and that we came together like that. So.
Yeah, no, that's quite the picture, and that's one of the things about the tornado too. It's just so fascinating to look at, and it's all the pictures of the devastation. For somebody at my standpoint that was not alive at that point in time and doesn't have any recollection of it. To see the destruction, because I'm from Slayton originally, and so the other F5 tornado that occurred here in southwest Minnesota and Chandler and Lake Wilson and those areas in 1992 on June 16th, it just kind of all comes together, the power of Mother Nature, and you just never know what might happen on these hot and humid summertime days. No, and you don't mean to scare anyone by whenever it gets hot and humid that this is going to happen. I mean, this is exceptionally rare, especially, if you think of all time, there's only been 2 of this magnitude, but that's not to say an F1 or an F2 it's not as powerful, it's not going to do as much. They have killed people too. Sure. It just depends on where you're at, and you need to take some precautions and things like that, but you just never know. It can come out of, just like the title of the book, it can come out of the blue. Yeah, for sure. In putting this together, too, I'm sure that, you've had the opportunity to talk with some of the people that were maybe community leaders in Tracy at the time and had to do some of the coordinating of getting things, in the immediate aftermath, organized a little bit. And as the weeks went past that date of June 13th, to kind of get Tracy cleaned up, too. I think the community leaders just did a phenomenal job for, not experiencing something. You're just not prepared for something like this, and they decided they really banded together. The whole town did, and got this cleaned up and helped everyone. And it went really quickly and smoothly. And the thing that impressed me the most from talking to so many people were, as in any town, you might not like your neighbor, you don't like person background, you don't like, things like that, and there was none of that. When something like this happened, it just seemed like they all became really close-knit group, and they helped each other, and there was nothing, you never thought of the word hate or anything after that happened. It was, so many people I talked to, they became good friends with someone that
they didn't get along with for years after this. And Greenwood, which is a southern suburb of Tracy, was on the other side of the railroad tracks, and they were always referred to as the people on the other side of the tracks. And that got hit the hardest and first, and the people on the other side of the tracks were immediately over there helping them. And it was never referred to like that again, that they were the other side of the tracks. It wasn't that they were poor or anything. It was almost like they were cut off. And it's just amazing how something like this brought everyone so back together so close. It was comforting to see that.
Yeah, for sure. I think if anybody out there that's listening this morning is, an experience, a direct experience that relates to this, we'd sure welcome a phone call or two. It'd be fun to hear some of the stories that people might be willing to share with us this morning. If you want to call, give us a call, 532-9626, and we'd be glad to hear any stories that you might want to share of that day. Because there are so many of them, Scott, and I'm sure you've only scratched the surface in talking with the people that you've had the opportunity to talk to in putting this book together.
Yeah, and the stories have been told in newspapers and things, and I didn't get into all of these side stories. I tried to focus on these two sisters more. I did touch on things that happened in town, and as I said, the hard part was there were so many different versions of the same story, so you had to get a hold of so many people and do the best you can. In some instances I had to play judge and jury by listening to all these different stories and trying to figure out exactly how it could have happened. And I'm not going to say that everything in there is 100% accurate, but it's what I was told and what I tried to get from what everyone told me. So. Okay,
all right. Well, hang on the line here with us, Scott. We're going to go ahead and take a phone call this morning and see if we can't get some of those stories from 1968 on this date, June 13th, 44 years ago, with the Tracy tornado. And we're going to go to the phone lines with Kay Reese joining us here in Marshall. And Kay, you lived in Tracy at that time.
I lived above Ullman Furniture Store.
Okay, tell us about that day for you.
Well, there was somebody coming down the street driving. I think it was Mr. Budolph's son. He used to work for Phillips 66, and he was just honking, just honking the horn. And I was standing in my window in the upstairs apartment, and he was pointing to the sky. And I went and got the other people who lived in the other apartments, and we huddled in my apartment underneath rugs. And again, it sounded just like a train. And when we thought it was over with, we went downstairs, and we could see that it was coming back. We got in my car, and we headed south out past Central Livestock. And when we saw that it was over with, we came back to town, parked the car. The first thing you could smell was natural gas. You could see the train cars on the street. One of the people who lived in the apartment, her parents owned Fireball Welding, and she was very concerned about them. So we walked from Ullman Furniture down through town to her parents to see if they were all right. They were. You went by houses that looked like doll houses. The sides of the houses were off, and it was a mess. And I needed to get a message to my parents in Walnut Grove that I was okay. I ran into somebody that had been at the nursing home, and they were going to tell them that. Once we got back, of course, it was getting dark. We had no electricity, and all you could hear was sirens. And that's kind of my memories of it. And I worked in Marshall, and you had to get a pass to get in and out of town from the National Guard because they weren't letting people in. But of course, when you worked out of town, then you got this pass to go back and forth. So it was quite an experience.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Kay, we appreciate you sharing with us this morning. Thanks much.
You're welcome.
You bet. Kay Reese with us here in Marshall that lived in Tracy at the time. And another caller on with us, Scott, if you'd hang on, Marianne Blanchette. And Marianne, I see here that you lived about 8 miles northeast of Tracy. Is that right? Share your experience of that day with us, if you would.
Well, my husband was on the phone with his mother, and someone interrupted her and said, "I need to use the phone. There's a tornado headed toward Tracy." So they hung up, and we looked out, and we could see it. It must have been in the town of Tracy at that time, and we knew the neighbors were over milking their cows in the barn, and they wouldn't see it. We went over and got them out of the barn, and And we all got in our car and drove away from it, which now they say you shouldn't do, but we saved them from getting hurt because the tornado did hit their farm place and did quite a bit of damage.
Huh.
And it damaged several farm places from Tracy to the northeast. The tornado came into our farm, and then it lifted.
Okay.
So it went 8 miles northeast of Tracy before it actually lifted up.
Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate you sharing your story this morning.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Marianne Blanchette joining us this morning there. Another call on the line here, this one from Leona Peterson, who was about 3.5 miles to the south of Tracy. Leona, good morning. Thanks for coming on with us.
Good morning. The tornado hit about 1/4 of a mile west of our farm, and it was Glenn Horstman's. And it came to the corner and went north 1/4 of a mile and took Charlie Carter's place. And we thought what it had done, it took their place, and they were out. We went out to see if they were okay, and they were out looking for things from the house because it took their place. And then my older son was playing ball north of town someplace, and he came in with the bus and couldn't get into Tracy. He had to walk in because the trees were down and everything. And then he helped some of the people find people. I can't remember, but I think it was the Mrs. Nelson. He and somebody else found. And it was real sad.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Leona, we thank you for sharing your story this morning.
You're welcome.
You bet. Leona Peterson there, sharing her experience from June the 13th of 1968. And we'll go back to Scott here for a moment. And Scott, I mean, there are just so many stories exactly like that of those personal experiences of helping one another out, and the tragedy that surrounded it too in many cases.
What was interesting was the previous caller Marianne Blanchette had mentioned about getting in the car and trying to outrun the tornado, and the last person that was killed, the last of the 9 in this tornado, was northeast of Tracy, and he'd gotten in his car and he was trying to outrun it. And no one had ever mentioned how he got killed or why he got sucked up by the tornado or whatever. And I looked for a lot of stories, and one of the extreme storm chasers who's been doing it for quite a while, that lives in Arkansas, had explained to me from looking at all the photos I sent that at the end of the tornado, the tail of it got all twisted instead of straight up and down. And they said when it starts to break up, it's similar to a child's top when it's spinning really nice and smooth, and when it slows up and starts to, it's going to stop, it'll wobble and flop all over the table. And they said that's what a tornado will do too. And they think that he's going away from the tornado thinking he's safe, and all of a sudden the tornado's not taking that same path it did, it's flopping all over, and they think that it hit him out there like that, and he didn't expect it to come back toward him.
Yes.
That was their guess on it anyway, and no one else had an explanation. I thought that was really good, the way they could tell that to me.
Yeah, and that's kind of the nice thing about dealing with the storm chasers that there are now, and the technology and the experiences that they've had in chasing these storms. A couple of more calls here on the line, Scott, if you'd be so kind to hold with us. We'll go here to Deb Deitz, who lived in Tracy at the time. Deb, good morning.
Hi. I was just going to share what I remember. I was only 5.5 at the time, but I vividly remember my dad yelling, "Get down the basement." And my grandparents from Marshall were over for supper. We went to the fruit cellar in the basement, and the men watched out the back door. I remember yelling at them, my mom yelling to get downstairs. But we lived on 3rd Street, and between 4th and 5th Street, that block was gone. So we were a block away from being gone. I remember there was bedpost that went through a bedroom window and down through our living room ceiling. And we had a lot of windows broken, but just a block away was wiped out.
Yeah.
And I remember all trees down and wires down and people looking for people and just all the what was demolished, the vehicles smashed with trees. And you don't remember much from when you're 5, but I remember that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Deb, we appreciate you sharing your story and your experience this morning. Mm-hmm. All right, Deb Knight's with us, joining us here, and she says she lived on the 3rd Street area there. Another call on the line. We'll go to Bev Holland, and Bev lived on the Highway 59 there south of Garvin. Bev, good morning.
Good morning, Heath. You know, you bring back a lot of memories with this show.
Yeah.
We watched the tornado form. It touched down in the inlet right across from our farm.
Sure.
And I got on the phone right away to call my parents in Tracy to warn them. And you know, that was the day of the party lines.
Oh, yeah.
And we had a neighbor that was on the line, and she was in town and her husband was at home. And she absolutely would not let me butt in. You know, I just was so upset with her because my folks lived in town at 6th and Emery. And when we got, and then we watched it go through Darrell Robinson's and went over there right away afterwards because it had taken the barn and messed up the house some. And we hauled their kids back over to our farm. And then got to Tracy, and my folks were just blocks away from it. But the worst thing my dad could find was a spoon that had been blown right into the wall of the garage.
Huh.
It had just stuck there. But, you know, I'm glad somebody's remembering all these times.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Bev, we appreciate you sharing your story this morning.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, Bev Holland there. She was there at the Highway 59 where they live there just south of Garvin. Another caller here on the line this morning. We'll see if we can get this one. Julie Jager, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, tell us a little bit about your experience.
I tell you, it wasn't me, but it was my husband. He was a coach, baseball coach over at Cottonwood. And I and my family lived there, of course. And we heard about it was going to be a real bad storm. So we went over to the neighbors. We didn't know. We stood out on the porch, and because they had a basement, we didn't. And my kids were just little, all the way from 2 to 10. And he had taken the busload of kids. He's a baseball coach for all summer and all. And I think it was a Legion team. A whole busload of these kids. And one of them said, it's heading towards Tracy. And that's where he was headed for. And don't you suppose, he just kept, he saw it. We could see the dust. You know, we knew something was going on because we were 30 miles away, but we could still see it across the field. And pretty soon he comes tearing back into town. And here he turned, they saw the tornado, and he had to hurry up and turn around and bring those kids back to Cottonwood. So they didn't get to Tracy, but thank goodness they didn't. Yeah,
that's for sure. Well, Julie, thanks for sharing your story this morning. All right, Julie Jager with us this morning, and more calls here as Scott's holding on the line with us. We appreciate your patience and willingness to be with us this morning, Scott. We're going to go to the line, and familiar voice here, Mr. Con Retmer. Good morning, sir.
Good morning again. Great interview, and I'm glad to hear Scott talk. I wish I would have been in town the weekend that he was signing his book. We certainly would have gone out and reminisced a little bit with him, too. I knew his dad very well. But, Scott was talking about the community leaders, how important they were in the aftermath of the tornado. And, of course, I recall this very vividly because we had a lot of politicians that came into our community. And at the time, I remember our governor was Harold Levander, and his administrative assistant was Dave Dernberger, who went on to be our United States Senator. And Scott well knows that one of the areas that got hit the worst was where up by the old Mitchell junkyard, where there was a lot of older homes and a lot of older displaced people. And the politicians, of course, wanted to know what they could do for the community. And one of the things that the city council and Dr. Jack Von Bokern was the head of the council at the time. I think the mayor was Dale Johnson, who lost his building on Highway 14, his auto repair shop. But anyway, they said that really we needed some housing for the elderly. And it just so happened that about a week before the tornado, the city had enacted the Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And so the governor sent out an individual from the state planning agency by the name of Alan Anderson, and I was with the chamber at the time. Alan, they named me, the city named me the executive director of the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and Alan and I sat down and in a week wrote a grant for an $880,000 60-unit housing project for the elderly, which today is Twin Circle Apartments. And it was, you might say, hand-carried to Chicago, to HUD and Washington, and all the politicians almost rubber-stamped it. And what happened in June, in September, we started to build, and 2 years later, it was open. So, you know, it's quite a thing that the community can come together like that, and I'm glad that I happen to be a part of it.
Yeah, you bet. Well, Con, thanks for sharing that this morning. You bet. Con Retmer there sharing his experience as Tracy, worked to rebuild from that day in June of 1968. And we'll go back to Scott. Scott, it's interesting to hear all of these stories and the different perspectives from, experiencing the tornado and the aftermath to, like Con mentioned there, working towards rebuilding Tracy.
Yeah, there's just so many different stories. Everyone has a different story to tell. There's so many positives that came from a negative that it's nice to hear all these. I'm glad to hear some of these people calling in, and some of these stories I've heard and some I haven't. And I think everybody I talked to, at least shared something that I had never heard before or read or anything. There's so many bizarre stories too of things that happened, things that got blown through. One example is our next door neighbor had a soda straw blown through his front window. It stuck halfway through there. It didn't break the glass real bad around, just a little chip. But if you can imagine trying to poke a straw through a glass window and leaving it sit halfway, it'd be almost impossible to do that. But he had pictures of it and everything, and I thought my folks had a picture of that to prove to people, but I couldn't find it anywhere. But I still remember seeing that straw halfway outside and halfway inside, and hardly anything damaged to the window.
Yeah, it's just unreal. Well, Scott, this book is just wonderful, and we're glad that you had the opportunity and took it to write about this day, June 13th, 1968, and some of the experiences specifically of the Hogan girls. But if folks are interested in picking this book up, Scott, how can they find it?
Well, it's not on the Amazon.com or anything right now because it just was released. I'm still working on that, but they can order it by going to www.thomabooks.com. That's THOMA books, one word, .com. And hopefully it'll be up to Amazon soon and to some e-readers and things like that. But there's also some books at the Wheels Across the Prairie Museum in Tracy that they can purchase there. So that's about right now, but hopefully it will be a little bit broader as I get going on it.
All right. Well, Scott, we certainly appreciate your time and generosity in joining us here this morning to talk about your book and talk about that day in Tracy's history of 1968, June the 13th. It's been a pleasure, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
You bet. Scott Thoma, author of Out of the Blue. It's telling of the true story of the two sisters and their miraculous survival of one of the most powerful tornadoes in Minnesota history. So again, we thank Scott for joining us this morning, and our thanks again to everybody who was willing to take a moment and share their recounts of that day in Tracy in 1968 this morning here on KMHL in Marshall.